I fairly recently did a video about the rule of two and the ways Sith break it, but I want to approach a kind of connected topic from a slightly different angle. Was Darth Maul actually a Sith? What did Palpatine actually intend for him to be, and in any case, what implications might that have for other characters? And before we get going, I'm not necessarily planning to land anywhere concretely here, I'm mostly just curious how other people think about this as well. When we first meet Maul in Episode 1, he's unequivocally positioned as one of two Sith Lords, because there can be no more and no less according to Yoda. But with the release of novels like Plagueis and then Maul Lockdown in the Legends continuity, we found out that there wasn't actually a time in Maul's own Sith Lordship where he wasn't actually the bottom of a three-rung Sith ladder, and Sidious was actually the official apprentice, not himself. In some ways, this did bring into question Maul's identity as a Sith. If there can only be two and Maul was the third, does that mean Maul was not actually a Sith? I think the short answer to this element of it is essentially what we went over in my prior video. The rule of two may have organizationally defined the Sith Order as the members of this pair in a pretty restrictive way, but that wasn't always how the Sith identified, and it doesn't impact most of their actual teachings. There were also other splinter Sith Orders out there at the same time, like the Lost Tribe, so I personally don't think it's worth much more than a kind of pointless technicality-based gotcha moment to say Maul wasn't a Sith because of this. What I think is more interesting, though, is whether this does position Maul in a distinct place from other characters we may reduce to the position of mere dark acolytes than true Sith Lords. If Maul can be a true Sith when he was actually an apprentice's apprentice, then in my opinion characters like Ventress, Lumaya, and even maybe Starkiller are pretty equally Sith in all but their lack of a Darth title. And a good element of this comes down to the intent and content of their training. One thing which I do think works against Maul here compared to someone like Ventress is the intent Palpatine had in training him. For Palpatine, there was some pretty distinct differences in how he approached his apprentices compared to the other Sith Lords in Bane's line. For Bane and Tenebris, even Plagueis to a lesser extent, the ones who we see in any real detail of this line at least, there was some implicit understanding that while they'd try to stick around as long as possible, the point was for their apprentice to potentially surpass them, or they at least had to pay lip service to this idea. They could get around this by saying, oh, they're actually not ready right now. Even Darth Bane tried to possess Darth Zana when he was beaten. Nobody as power hungry as the Sith really wants to fall in that sword, but they at least had to respect the kayfabe of being a Sith, passing that knowledge on to the next generation. Plagueis tended to go more in the direction of saying he and Sidious could rule as a partnership. But for Sidious, there was never really much of a pretense that any of Maul, Dooku, or even Vader being expected to like this video and subscribe for more, let alone usurp him. Maul in particular was training more as an attack dog than a real Sith apprentice. Over time, the Sith tended to reveal more elements of their plans to their apprentices and set them up to be more parts of the Sith machinations, but even just before his death, Maul was pretty in the dark about anything the Sith were really doing, and he never truly understood his place in the hierarchy. To be fair, he was only about 22 when Obi-Wan cut him in half in The Phantom Menace, but he had been training under Palpatine for almost his entire life, and in Maul Lockdown, set shortly before Episode 1, he was expressing dissatisfaction with the lack of information about the goals he was working towards. At the same time, there were some indications from Sidious that his first apprentice may have actually meant more to him than just being a dark side assassin, although he was still only being considered in the position of a servant. Quote, yes, when Sidious reflected back on the years of training that Maul had endured, proving himself repeatedly against the worst the galaxy had to offer, he felt an unmistakable pride in his apprentice's strength and fortitude. By definition, Cog Hive 7 was an environment which no one survived, yet Maul had already established himself as a dominant presence without relying on the Force. Despite what he'd said to Maul, Sidious felt an increasing respect for what his apprentice continued to achieve. In the fullness of time, such abilities would continue to serve him better than he could possibly imagine, end quote. But beyond this, we also get some of Plagueis' perspective on Maul, confirming that he didn't really see him as a true Sith apprentice and didn't really see the capability that Maul had to become one, although his position was influenced by the fact that he knew himself and Palpatine to be the rule of two pair, and Palpatine had done significant work to convince Plagueis that Maul was not his apprentice in a true Sith sense. But Plagueis wouldn't be entirely blind to the capability someone had to be a real Sith, and he makes some interesting comparisons to Palpatine's next apprentice, Dooku, in Lockdown. Quote, except for the fact that Dooku, unlike the Dathomiri Zabrak whom Sidious had trained, would never be content to serve as an apprentice or a mere assassin. He would demand to become a true Sith, and that would lead to trouble. A better course of action would be to allow Dooku to find his own way to the dark side, whatever version of it might be accessible to him through study of the Sith holocrons the Jedi possessed. Better to have him leave the Order of his own accord and become the benevolent spokesperson for the disenfranchised, as one might expect from a being of high status. Yes, better to let him persuade worlds and systems to secede from the Republic and foment a civil war into which the Jedi could be drawn. Of course, we know that after Plagueis' death, Dooku does become a true Sith apprentice to Palpatine. But while Plagueis may have been unaware of many of Palpatine's plans, I think there's something he did identify about the relationship between Maul and Palpatine. Staying with Lockdown, Maul expresses a feeling of disconnect with the Sith Grand Plan, although he does still get referred to as and refer to himself as a Sith Lord. But Maul's expressions of devotion to Sidious never seem anything but genuine, and his personal ambitions seem limited to serving his master rather than becoming the Sith Master himself someday, although age may still be a factor there. With Dooku, Palpatine may never have intended for him to be anything but a placeholder for Vader and a useful part of the Clone Wars, but Dooku himself would have had higher ambitions, and I think that is what Darth Plagueis recognized. Dooku is of course still surprised when Palpatine betrays him, but that seems to be more about the circumstances than the fundamental idea that they might not always be partners. But to be fair, when Plagueis was killed, he was surprised that his reshaping of the Sith into a partnership wasn't something Palpatine had actually bought into. With Maul, though, it wasn't really an idea that they'd someday be equals, he was just serving his master. This changes after his bisection, but from then on he's less concerned about his identity as a Sith than about the revenge he can exact on people who have wronged or abandoned him, like his old master and Obi-Wan. But assuming we do let him stay in the pantheon of Sith for the period, I think this needs to apply to a few other people as well. Not all of Palpatine and Vader's underlings were trained as anything other than more generalized dark side Force users, but some were exposed to actual Sith teachings and did envision themselves as being the inheritors of the Sith legacy. Ventress, for example, did see herself as an apprentice in waiting in an actual Sith pairing. When proving herself worthy to be an apprentice for Dooku, she announces herself as a Sith. He laughs at this, saying she's afraid and a real Sith wouldn't be, but she has an ambition and a tie to Sith teachings, which I think surpasses what we see from Maul. Sidious exhibits far more fear of her existing in the wings under Dooku's training than his own master ever felt from Maul being under Sidious's, although, as we've alluded to, Plagueis was a bit deluded. This went as far as Dooku being ordered to dispose of her, although the timeline gets weird after this. There are others, particularly Lumaya, whose training is fairly similar during the Imperial period. Her training in actual Sith history and philosophy seems to have been much deeper under Vader and Palpatine than most of their other dark side user servants. But unlike Ventress, who was sent packing during the Clone Wars, Lumaya was able to continue her training not just under Vader, but also under Palpatine, which is what allowed her to try to resurrect the Sith Order as a Dark Lady herself, with Flint and then Darth Caedus as her apprentices. So she called herself the Dark Lady of the Sith all the time, but she never pretends that she could really hold the mantle of Sith Master. She doesn't take a Darth title the way that Caedus does or her predecessors do, although she still does refer to herself as a Dark Lady of the Sith. So again, I'm not necessarily here to pass any final judgments on this topic, but in my opinion, while I think Maul can keep his Sith Lord moniker, I think similar logic would then apply to Lumaya and perhaps most controversially Ventress as well. Let me know what you think in the comments though, that's really what this video is for. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video even though it's a bit more open-ended than usual, and I hope to see you next time.